Step aside, please. This photograph is for the family. Heloise Whitmore, 63-year-old mother of Adrian and wife of Wallace Whitmore, said it with a smile that looked gracious from a distance. Up close, her eyes told a different story. She placed one hand on Lyra Fenner Whitmore's elbow, not firmly, but with just enough pressure to suggest this was not a suggestion, and guided her 2 steps to the left, away from the cluster of people arranged in front of the tower's glass entrance. The photographer adjusted his lens. The frame filled with Wallace Whitmore, 67-year-old founder of Whitmore Development Group, standing at the center. Adrian Whitmore, 39, his son and head of development strategy, stood at his right. Portia Sloan, 31, Whitmore Development's vice president of communications, stood at Adrian's left shoulder. Heloise rejoined them, folding her hands in front of her as though the moment were perfectly ordinary. Lyra Fenner Whitmore, 33-year-old wife of Adrian, stood 2 steps outside the frame in a pale grey dress that Heloise had sent to her hotel suite the night before. She had worn it without comment. Around her, 400 guests raised champagne flutes beneath the lights of the building that bore her husband's family name. The tower rose 43 stories above a city waterfront, glass and steel, the kind of structure people photographed from across the lake. Everyone in the room believed the Whitmore family had built it. Adrian glanced at her once, then he looked back toward the camera. Lyra touched the small pin on her lapel, 2 overlapping geometric shapes, like the corners of a blueprint meeting. Her father had designed it. She breathed through the next several seconds while flashes went off and laughter rose from somewhere she could not see. After the photograph, a solicitor named Denton approached her near the back of the reception floor. He held a cream-colored envelope. "Mr. Whitmore asked me to give you this." She opened it. The words divorce petition were printed at the top of the first page. Adrian's signature was already on it. She did not look up immediately. From across the room, she could see Portia reaching up to adjust Adrian's lapel pin before they walked together toward the stage for Wallace's keynote address. She watched him allow it. She watched the way Portia leaned to say something and the way Adrian smiled at whatever she said. Lyra folded the envelope back and placed it inside her bag. No one in the room knew who she was. They knew her as Adrian Whitmore's quiet wife. A woman who showed up at events, said the right things to donors, and disappeared before the photographs were published. They had never asked what she did when she left. None of them knew her father's name was Leopold Vane, and none of them understood what that name meant. Leopold Vane had been one of the most respected structural architects of his generation in the country, though he had spent his life avoiding rooms exactly like this one. His firm, Meridian Design Holdings, had completed 11 landmark buildings across 3 provinces. Not one bore his name on the exterior. He had said once that a building should outlast the man who designed it, and that putting your name on stone was how you proved you had run out of ideas. He had also said that money is a mirror. What it shows you about the people around you is not always pleasant. He died when Lyra was 26. Before he did, he placed every share of Meridian inside a private trust and named her the only beneficiary. The Vane Design Trust held not only the shares in Meridian Design Holdings, but the architectural copyright and intellectual property rights attached to every building his firm had ever designed. Under the terms of those agreements, any property developed using Meridian's original plans required the trust's written consent before it could be sold, refinanced, or transferred to a new owner. Lyra had used her mother's surname her entire adult life. She was Lyra Fenner, then Lyra Fenner Whitmore. Almost no one connected her to the Vane name. She lived simply, worked quietly, and had never asked the world to recognize what she had inherited. Before her marriage, when Wallace Whitmore had insisted on a prenuptial agreement, she had signed it without protest. The agreement protected separately held property on both sides. Wallace believed he was shielding Whitmore Development from a woman he considered unremarkable. He did not read the clause carefully enough to understand he had also shielded every asset inside the Vane Design Trust from his own son. 14 months earlier, Whitmore Development had nearly collapsed. The credit facility supporting their flagship projects had been withdrawn after a lender review found over-leveraged assets and miscategorized construction invoices. Several contractors were unpaid. 2 projects had stopped mid. 300 construction workers had gone 3 weeks without wages. Adrian had come home on a Thursday night and sat at the kitchen table without taking off his coat. He told Lyra the company might not survive the month. She had stayed with him until he fell asleep. Then she had called Blythe Osey, 44, Meridian's chief operating officer and one of only 3 people who knew Lyra's full role as the trust's sole director. By the following Friday, Meridian had structured a rescue package, an emergency loan guarantee tied to the copyright licenses already embedded in Whitmore's most valuable properties. Contractors were paid. Workers returned to the sites. The lender crisis was resolved through a legal arrangement that kept the Whitmore name intact and kept Lyra's role invisible. She had also quietly agreed to allow Wallace to retain his public chairman title during the transition to avoid the kind of investor panic that would have destabilized the company further. Adrian had called it a miracle. He had assumed anonymous market investors had stepped in. He had never asked Lyra what she did when she left for her office in the evenings. The morning after the Whitmore Tower opening, Lyra sat at the window of the suite she had booked herself. The divorce petition was open on the table in front of her. Blythe had driven up the night before without being asked, and Helena Marsh, 47, Lyra's personal counsel and the attorney who had known the Vane Trust since Leopold's death, was already seated across from her. "The building in the photograph," Helena said, without looking up from the documents she was sorting. "Walk me through the copyright position." Lyra looked out at the tower. In the morning light, the glass panels caught the water and scattered it upward. Her father had designed the curtain wall system. He had spent 4 months on the thermal specifications alone. "Meridian holds the original design license," she said. "The structural intellectual property, the plans, the system specifications, the phased construction documentation. Every modification since then has been derivative of the original. Under the existing agreement, if Whitmore attempts to sell or refinance the tower, they need Meridian's written clearance. And Meridian is yours. The trust controls it entirely." Helena placed her pen down. "Then the portfolio sale Wallace announced last night. The international investment group he mentioned in his speech cannot proceed without my consent." The room was quiet. Helena picked the pen back up. "Adrian's solicitor says the petition was filed yesterday morning, before the opening. He signed it before the photograph was taken." Helena looked at her steadily. "He let you stand through that entire event knowing he had already filed?" Lyra said nothing. "I want to send a preservation notice to Whitmore Development's records before noon," Helena said. "Email, expense accounts, travel records, project filings. Do it, but don't touch the employee pension records. Don't freeze operations accounts. Whatever we do, the construction crews keep working." The audit took 11 days. Blythe coordinated with the independent investigators that Meridian's board had retained months earlier. Before Lyra had disclosed anything about the divorce, the findings were worse than the first reports suggested. Portia Sloan had submitted travel invoices categorized as site communication campaigns. The actual destinations were a private resort in the Okanagan and a boutique hotel in Montreal, where she and Adrian had been registered under the same suite. Interior renovation costs at a private property owned by Wallace had been invoiced to a Whitmore subsidiary as executive hospitality upgrades. The company credit facility that Meridian's guarantee had secured had been used in part to fund those invoices. There was also a series of messages between Portia and Whitmore's communications director, a man named Trent, who had been preparing a media release. The release described Lyra as emotionally unstable, claiming she had resisted the divorce process and threatened legal obstruction. It was dated 2 days after the tower opening. It had not yet been sent. Blythe brought the file to Lyra in the Meridian offices on a grey afternoon. Lyra read it without speaking. The words were precise and cold, the kind of language someone had worked to assemble carefully. She recognized the strategy. Remove her name from the photograph first, then remove her name from the story, then release a version of events in which she was the problem. She set the file aside. "How are the workers on the Lakeshore project?" she asked. Blythe looked up. 42 crew on site as of this morning. "Confirmed?" "Through the end of the quarter." "Good." Lyra stood and looked through the window at the skyline. 2 of the buildings visible from where she stood had been designed by her father. One of them bore the Whitmore name above its lobby. "Schedule the independent board for the end of the week, and contact the lenders who were part of the original rescue. They'll need to understand the copyright position before any portfolio sale moves forward." Heloise called on a Wednesday. Lyra watched the name appear on her phone for 3 rings before answering. "I want you to understand that what happened at the tower was not personal," Heloise said. "The photograph was for corporate materials. You are not a corporate figure." Lyra sat very still. "I understand. I hope you'll agree to conclude this quietly. Wallace is very close to finalizing the investment group arrangement. Anything disruptive would be damaging to a great many people." I know. Adrian says you've retained counsel. That's fine. We would simply prefer not to have this drawn out. I won't draw it out, Lyra said. Tell Wallace I'd like to meet before the portfolio sale announcement. There are some title clearance items that need to be discussed. There was a pause. Helos did not know what title clearance meant in this context, and she did not ask. She assumed Lyra meant something small. She had always assumed that. The meeting that Wallace's assistant arranged was not the meeting he had expected. It was held in Meridian's boardroom, not Whitmore's. Ansels Reed, 58, Meridian's lead independent director and the Trust's board representative, opened the session. Two outside legal teams were present. Helena sat to Lyra's right. Blythe sat to her left. The Whitmore side of the table had brought Wallace, Adrian, their corporate solicitors, and a representative from the International Investment Group, a man who had flown in the night before for what he believed would be a routine portfolio review. Wallace looked at the room and said, I was told this was an administrative title matter. Ansel placed a document in front of him. It is. It concerns the title chain for every property in the proposed sale. The international representative opened his copy. He read the first 2 pages, then turned back to the beginning and read them again. Lyra watched Wallace's face. She had seen it at dinners, at site visits, at events where he raised a glass and thanked the people who had built his company with him. He had never once thanked her. She had been invisible to him from the moment Adrian introduced her. Ansel set down his pen. Meridian Design Holdings holds the original architectural copyright for 11 Whitmore properties in the current portfolio, including Whitmore Tower, the Harborview Center, and the Lakeshore development currently under construction. Under the license agreements signed at each project's inception, transfer of title, refinancing, or redesignation of ownership interest requires written consent from the Vane Design Trust. Wallace stared at him. We have dealt with Meridian for 12 years. Yes, Ansel said. Meridian is an independent firm. It is held entirely within the Vane Design Trust. Ansel nodded toward Lyra, which is directed by its sole beneficiary. The international representative set his documents down very slowly. Wallace turned to look at Adrian. Adrian looked at Lyra. She met his gaze. She did not look away first. The trust is yours, Adrian said. It was not a question. My father placed Meridian inside it before he died. You assumed it was a small collection of managed funds. You never asked. Something moved across Adrian's face that she had not seen there in years. It was not anger. It was the particular flattening shock of understanding the full shape of what you have destroyed. The portfolio sale was paused. It could not proceed without the trust's written consent, and the trust had not given it. The International Investment Group departed the same evening. The independent board opened a formal review. Lyra disclosed her marriage and the divorce petition at the outset and recused herself from every vote connected to Adrian's employment. She would not allow anyone to claim she had used the company to punish a man for stopping loving her. The findings moved through the process the way such findings do, not quickly, but with the particular force of documentation bearing someone's signature on every page. Portia's employment was terminated after the committee verified falsified travel records and personal expenses submitted under corporate category codes. The committee also found she had been involved in drafting the media release that had been prepared but not sent. Trent, the communications director, resigned before the committee reached him and said nothing in his resignation letter about the draft. It was already in Meridian's possession. Wallace lost the public chairmanship through a formal board resolution. His protected transition title, maintained after the rescue solely to preserve investor confidence, expired under the terms of the original arrangement that Lyra had approved 14 months earlier. He retained his minority shareholder rights and nothing further. Adrian was suspended during the review and terminated when the committee completed its findings. The grounds included misuse of corporate travel accounts, concealment of a conflict of interest involving a direct report, and approval of expense submissions that had been materially misrepresented. The evidence was documentary. His signature appeared on most of it. Lyra learned all of this through Blythe and Helena. She was not present at the committee's concluding session. She was in the Meridian offices reviewing the construction schedule for Lakeshore, the project Wallace had once told donors would cement the Whitmore legacy for a generation. She had made sure the crew was paid. She had made sure the materials deliveries were not disrupted. She had made sure the 42 workers on that site would not open their phones one morning and find that a family dispute had ended their contracts. When Helena called to confirm the committee's final decision, Lyra stood at the window with the phone against her ear and did not say much. She asked whether the pension contributions had been restored to the schedule Meridian had agreed to in the rescue terms. Helena said yes. She asked whether the general contractor's outstanding invoices had been cleared. Helena said yes. Then we're done with that part, Lyra said. The divorce was finalized 3 months later, under the terms of the prenuptial agreement. The separate property clauses applied to both sides equally. Everything inside the Vane Design Trust remained exactly where it had always been, where it had been when Helois dismissed Lyra at every dinner, when Wallace gave speeches that never included her name, when Adrian signed a petition in the morning and stood beside his wife in the afternoon, for a photograph she was not allowed to be in. A letter arrived at the Meridian offices 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. It was handwritten on plain paper. She recognized Adrian's writing before she opened it. He did not ask her to reconsider. He did not blame his parents or Portia or the pressures of the company. He wrote that he had spent the month since the boardroom understanding what it meant that she had saved the company in silence and then watched him receive credit for its survival. He wrote that he had finally found the question he should have asked years earlier, not what she owned, but what she had quietly carried while he looked through her. He wrote that he understood, at last, why no apology could restore what he had chosen to dismantle. Lyra read the letter at her desk. She placed it in a drawer beside the architectural sketch her father had given her the year she graduated, a single-line drawing of a building rising from its foundation, made in 30 seconds on a piece of notepaper, signed LV in the lower corner. She did not write back, but she did not discard the letter either. The Slakeshore building was completed the following spring. It was the most significant project Meridian had overseen since Leopold Vane's death. 31 stories of residential and mixed-use space, designed to the passive house standard, with a community arts center on the ground floor that had been written into the plans from the beginning. No family name above the entrance, just the address in clean letter forms and the street. At the completion ceremony, a group of tradespeople from the construction crew stood at the front. Lyra stood with them. Blythe said a few words about the Meridian team. Ansel thanked the general contractor. Then a woman named Cecile, the site's project foreman, stepped forward and said she wanted to name the person who had made sure payroll cleared on the 3 Fridays during the audit. When every other account in the development chain had been frozen, she said her crew had never asked why the money arrived on time. They had simply kept working. She said she had found out later, from a profile in an architecture journal that had finally identified the trust's director by name. We kept working, Cecile said, because of her. Lyra looked at the building. The curtain wall caught the afternoon light the way her father's buildings always did. Not showy but certain. She thought about the photograph she had been guided out of and the cream-colored envelope delivered to her by a solicitor, while 400 guests toasted the people who had decided she was nothing. She did not feel vindicated exactly. Vindication was the wrong word for what this was. What she felt was quieter than that. Like returning to a room after a long absence and finding it still standing exactly as you left it. She had hidden the shape of her inheritance because her father had taught her that love built on the knowledge of your assets is not love. She had held that lesson through 7 years of dinners where Helois placed her at the edge of the table, through corporate events where her name appeared in the program, only as Adrian Whitmore's spouse, through a morning when a man she had once loved handed her a legal document and turned back toward a camera without flinching. She had wanted to know what he would choose when he believed she had nothing. He had answered. That answer had not broken her. It had clarified something she had spent years refusing to look at directly, that the silence she had kept to protect the honesty of love had outlasted the love itself, and that it was time to stop keeping it. The afternoon sun moved behind the roofline. Lyra put her coat on and walked with Blythe and Cecile toward the street, past the crews packing their equipment and the families who had already begun moving into the upper floors. She did not look back as she left. Her father had always said the work speaks for itself. The architect just has to get out of the way. Her phone sounded as she reached the corner. It was Ansel, with a message about a new project brief. A municipality in the northeast had approached Meridian about a transit hub. Something complex, something that would take years, something that mattered. She read the message once, then she put the phone away and kept walking. There was more to build.